it's Ivy Slater, and you're listening to Her Success Story podcast, a show where gutsy businesswomen share their success journey. Hi, it's Ivy Slater, and welcome to today's episode of Her Success Story. We are in a dynamic and wonderful series right now. We are in the process of interviewing various different people that's talking about the impact of women on boards. And there's been different statistics shared and different episodes, different perspectives. And today I have the honor and the pleasure of having two members who are both partners at Deloitte. And I want to really give a huge shout out to Deloitte. Deloitte is one of the earliest companies to really initiate women in leadership. And let me share a little bit. I have Ellen Stafford. Ellen has been with Deloitte for 30 years in managing consulting. She has worked in life science and other industries in M&A, restructuring, market strategy, business planning, and operations. You'll be able to read Ellen's entire bio in the show notes. Joining Ellen and I today is Andrew Vaz. Andrew is Deloitte's leader for ecosystems and alliances. People in the lingo say that's called E&A. Andrew is responsible for governance and execution of Deloitte's global alliances and ecosystems, including strategy, operating models, funding, marketing, and finance performance. Two incredibly insightful people, wonderful perspectives. And Ellen, Andrew, thank you for taking time out of busy days and busy lives to join me here on Her Success Story.
It's terrific to be here. Thank you, Ivy.
Likewise.
So tell me, and either of you want to jump in, back when we were all younger and coming up in the business world, what drove each of you to say, hey, I see myself getting involved in boards, or what would it be like for me to get involved in boards?
Well, Ivy, maybe I can kick us off here. So for me, it was about 10 years ago when I joined what's called the Deloitte Board Council Program, which is really a year internship of getting exposed to the board of directors, attending meetings, et cetera. And that really exposed me to governance, and I do recommend that many companies consider it. During that process, I began to build a passion and curiosity for governance. I got involved early to build an experience base for board opportunities later in my career, which then materialized. And I also wanted to leverage my innovation technology background into the governance space, where I saw this as a needed skill and a differentiator, and specifically to help boards govern during this rapid time of technology disruption.
And Ellen, what about you? Is this something you always wanted to do? Is this something that just appeared for you one day as an opportunity?
Well, actually, a little bit of both. It was actually about 20 years ago. I was a relatively new partner. I was leading actually our women's initiative, which you mentioned in the early days for consulting. And I did some volunteer work, but I was thinking about, okay, how can I leverage my business experience, the capability I have as an advisor, as a consultant, and do something that might have a greater impact than volunteer work? And through the Women's Initiative, through some other things, I did get exposed to Girls Incorporated. And in '99, I joined the national board. And my goal really was to try to give back, but also to learn about being on a board. I didn't know what it would be like. And what I did learn is that not only could I bring my experience, my business experience to bear, and my experience as an advisor through consulting, but I learned that I was actually pretty comfortable with governance, which means you do need to step back. It's an oversight role, it's not management, and not everyone's comfortable with that. But I was comfortable with that and I liked it. So then actually being on the Deloitte board became something that I thought it would be good to do down the road. Obviously that's for more senior partners. But the experience of being on the Girls Incorporated board, having chaired board committees, knowing the difference between governance and management was actually helpful when I interviewed, because we all have to interview with the nominating committee to be on the Deloitte board. And I didn't know at the time, way back in '99, but by the time I was interviewing in 2007, that experience and that mindset and that understanding and comforts with being in a governance role was very helpful in taking that next step to being on the board of a large enterprise. So, and I for me, I love governance. I think I'm actually something that I've learned is a pretty good capability and fits very well with my experience over decades now of being a consultant and an advisor.
I love it, and I love it. Andrew, I can't agree with you more. I hope more and more organizations and companies start board council programs to understand and get the younger, let's meet them where they're young and learn and educate on up. So what's the difference you see when women are involved on boards versus boards that might be much more male dominated, or maybe even have 1 or 0 women on them?
And I can start this one, and I'll use my Deloitte board experience, and maybe later I'll compare and contrast with Girls Incorporated, which is predominantly women, and another school board I serve on, which until recently was mostly men. But when I joined the Deloitte board in 2007, we actually had a woman as the chair of the board starting her 2nd term, Sharon Allen, and our board was about 1/3 women. And I'll come back to the reasons for that. But I don't like to generalize, but there are differences often in how women frame issues and raise questions. And it really is the questions. Women will ask questions not just about information or to get facts, which we all do, but sometimes it's a way of opening up a different angle of thought. We don't necessarily have the answer, but we want to go deeper, or we want to make sure that we raise a different perspective or get us all to think about something from a different perspective, open up a different dialogue. I remember one terrific woman board member from whom I learned a good deal. She would sometimes pause and ask a question that would be, okay, if we play this out 2 to 3 years, and this might be a very specific financial initiative, but she would say, what do we think our staff would see? What would have happened, and could this detract from our talent initiatives? And the topic wouldn't necessarily have been at all a talent topic, but she would tie things together and make us step back and look at the whole system and do that so that we were opening up a different avenue and making sure we took a strategic and a long-term view. And I know I would, particularly since my role was not a management role in my day job, it is more of a client leadership role. I sometimes would raise questions about an initiative or a strategic imperative and say, okay, how strategic do we think this is if we step back and look at this from a client perspective? If we do this, would it really make a difference in our ability to serve our clients? It would really make a difference in how we go to market? Or are we just kind of getting a little bit too wrapped up in our own internal structural challenges? So I think raising a question doesn't mean you have an answer, but raising a question to change the dialogue is something I see women doing quite often. I don't know, Andrew, what your perspective is on that.
No, I think that was a great depiction of how the dynamic works out. I would add a couple of things. There's no question you're getting diversity of thought and diversity of perspective by having women and other diverse representatives on the board. I think if you also look at how our organizations are evolving, you're getting better stakeholder representation, as boards must reflect the entire population and segments of the organization. Equally, you're getting access to diverse skills and experience, which include industry skills, functional skills, and operational experience. And women represent a very large talent pool that increasingly must be tapped into. And then many studies show that you do get a competitive advantage. Ellen gave some great examples of how the dynamic changes just with questioning. And that creates a competitive advantage as a board is more effective in assessing issues, making decisions, etc. So I think it's terrific.
And I love how you're positioning this and sharing it as a competitive advantage. And it's not competitive amongst the members of the board, but it's a competitive advantage of organizations positioning themselves for success out there.
Yeah, I think what Ellen talked about is I describe it as you end up in a dynamic where you wrestle the issue down in a more complete, thorough, and robust way. So you have the pros and cons and the different vantage points around the issue. And I think that's what leads to better decision-making and ultimately competitive advantage.
Agree completely.
Absolutely. So what would you like to see in the future regarding more women on boards, more diversity? Coming from this perspective of it setting up a competitive advantage industry-wise, business-wise, where would the next level of growth, what could that look like?
Well, I think this is obviously a very complex topic, but I think that clearly the biggest lever I'd like to see us pull is, exponentially improving the pool of candidates and getting more men and women engaged in pipeline development for candidates. I think that we need to have more global perspective in our candidates going forward, because as the world becomes very small and we can continue to globalize business, that is critical. I think, Ellen mentioned term limits earlier. Term limits are very important. I think the current term limit in Fortune 500 boards is just under 9 years. I think if we shorten that, that'll create the opportunity for more diversity and programmatic sponsorship. So it's institutionalized in our organizations. And then, truly cultivating broader pools in key segments of the population, whether it's women in technology or women in private equity, et cetera. It's also interesting that you see some examples of good jurisdictions in various states, like California in 2015, Pennsylvania 2017, where they're mandating certain requirements to be on a number of women to be on boards. And I also think, one way to pull the lever for increasing the pool is we attack the broader issue of women in leadership positions, because they clearly are part of the pool for board of directors. And then I'd like to see one other thing, and that's a call to action for women directly, which is start young, think globally, have an online presence, have a board CV, and most importantly, increasingly importantly, keep your tech savvy index up. The world of—
Explain that a little bit.
What I mean by that is, and we have this program at Deloitte where we make sure that all of our staff and partners, have a certain level of technology savvy or technology knowledge that allows us to solve, business problems for our clients, et cetera. And I think whether you're solving a client business problem or you're sitting on a board or you're in management, if you're not really appreciating the disruption that emerging technologies present, whether it's artificial intelligence or cloud or AR, VR, et cetera, and how that changes business models, it's very, very hard to be able to be part of that decision-making, whether you're in management or the board. So that tech-savvy piece becomes very important, particularly given that we're seeing, these changes now happening in 18 months, 2-3 years, as opposed to 5-10 years ago. 5-10 years, a decade ago.
So when you reference starting young, what does that look like? So, on a personal side, I'm a mom of kids who are both in the workforce. They're under 30, but they're both working for a large organization. I was with my daughter's girlfriends who work all over at different places, major organizations across this country. What does starting young look like?
Yeah. Well, maybe there are a couple things that I've seen and we've seen, and that actually Deloitte is now trying to foster, which is starting young. I think, if the best way to get experience on a board early is a not-for-profit board. But even that, when you're in your 20s, maybe seem beyond your reach in terms of your experience. But there actually are a number of organizations that either have junior boards or do seek that have board councils, advisory groups, et cetera, to get involved in those for two reasons. One, it gives you experience. You understand what a board does. You understand how to help an organization in some way in addition to direct volunteer work. It clearly is a gift of your talent, your time and your talent. So it's volunteer, but of a different type. And the other thing is it's expanding your network in a different angle outside of your direct work. We're actually involved at Deloitte now, encouraging our younger people to get involved in junior boards and giving them some of the training to help so that more of our people can, in addition to volunteer work, which we foster, and we actually have this Friday is our annual Impact Day, which is a full day of our people spending time in their communities. But in addition to volunteer work, we want people to serve on boards. Professional services, my goodness, what kind of talent that is in terms of board members giving time and talent. We need to encourage more of our people, but we need to give them the opportunity and we need to help them with some of the training. And that's what we're doing as one company. But if other companies do that, but also if younger people seek out those opportunities, it's a good way to gain the experience. And by the way, to know whether or not you enjoy it. Board work and governance is not for everyone, and that's perfectly fine. But if it is for you, then how you grow that and accelerate your growth and have more impact is tremendous.
Ivy, there's another angle to this around the start young, and that is, I think age and youth is also going to become an important diversity factor on boards as you start to see more and more CEOs in their late 20s and early 30s in Silicon Valley and some of the big digital giants. So, it was interesting. I was having a dialogue in our nominating committee 2 years ago. I sat on this committee that nominates board members for our board. And we were having a good discussion about, as you look at the workforce and the large majority of millennials that will occupy that workforce, the question often is asked, who represents adequately and effectively that population in the boardroom? And so I think this becomes important as well.
And to pick up on that, I do think the start young is obviously back to your children, Ivy, and to young people. But then to Andrew's point, is the sponsorship is important, and engaging people who will be that next generation of board members that companies can do with things like our board council, but individuals can do that. And if you picture what could happen out in the corporate world, if in fact every current board member sponsored someone and tried to engage someone 20 years younger, because a lot of these board members are in their 60s, and tried to get them further along in their understanding of governance, their potential, and on other boards, that would be a huge impact. And if a high percentage of those were women, and next gen younger people, people in their 30s, that would actually help that diversity of boards as well. So the individual sponsorship of current board members to try to refresh their boards is incredibly important. It may not fit with the self-interest, so we have to understand that, but I think that's where term limits would start to make that part of self-interest, because you want the board to succeed after you move on, after your term. But that's not, unfortunately, structurally part of our boards in the United States right now. But I think it can be, and it should be, and it would have a tremendous impact.
So I love that you touched on and explained a little bit about sponsorship, because a lot of people are well versed in it, and there are some listeners who I'm sure that are not. And I really loved also how you referenced, so if a board member took notice of somebody 20 years their junior, 20 years younger than, and took sponsorship or mentored them and enhanced their education of what's possible of becoming part of a board.
I think it would have a huge impact, and it may not be on the board. If someone's on a Fortune 100 board, that may not, but if they get them onto other boards, they're basically increasing the pipeline of future board members and high caliber board members, which obviously it's good for the individual, good for diversity, and it's good for the future of our businesses. If, to Andrew's point, you have freshness and diversity of thinking sooner, and that includes youth.
So when you're talking about term, what do you, either of you, see as ideal? You've both served, or I know, Ellen, you have served on Deloitte's board. Andrew, are you still a current board member, or have you completed your term?
I've just completed a term, yes. Just like literally last week.
Wow, we got you like right hot off the presses, so to speak.
Exactly, and I was on both the Deloitte Global Board as well as the US board.
Yep. And our term limits, just to provide context, would be different, I think, than the corporate world. We have a limit of 2 3-year terms, which, by the way, I credit that with the fact that we've had a third women for well over a dozen years, because we've had term limits, and therefore there needs to be a refreshing of the board, and you go to a broader group, and you go to younger people, and you keep that fresh. That probably would not be feasible necessarily in a large corporation, but an 8-year term, or an 8-year or a 10-year, that still would open up an awful lot of seats on American boards.
How do you see the dynamic difference when men and women are working together? And Andrew, you referenced earlier, more women in leadership. And what would you like to see, if we're at 2019 now, what would you like to start seeing in 2025 that we could start painting a picture of what's possible?
Well, I think, and we actually have an aspiration, not specifically to the boards, but certainly in executive and leadership positions at Deloitte, where it is 50-50. And and this is, I think a critical lever. And, it's now the accountability of all of the leaders across the global enterprise to make sure we get to that 50-50 aspiration. And if you break that down into the actual mathematics, it's almost impossible because the pool isn't there, which forces you to make some unnatural and aggressive, very aggressive and proactive moves to increase your pool. But what tends to happen is in the short term, you're stuck because you've got people that are double and triple hatting leadership positions and also for board positions. So, I think one of the things I'd like to see is very formal, very programmatic approaches to board candidate development, because I'm sure, and as to many other companies, have management development programs. And yes, Deloitte has a board council program, but outside of that, it's not even nearly sufficient to address what we want to achieve from a 50-50 perspective. So I think having a board development, candidate development program that is institutionalized, and you can find, Ellen very eloquently talked about her early years in governance, how she got very comfortable and very confident playing the governance role. There are many people, and as we look at leadership succession within our organization, you can see people that gravitate to governance or gravitate to management. So I think finding those early signals, identifying them, detecting them, putting them in a formal program would be great. And I also believe that what I said earlier about technology savvy and having that built into it, and how do you govern in a world of disruption where you have new risks created by new technologies that can have significant shareholder value impact on companies. I'd like to see that be institutionalized as well.
I think that those are key. And then you asked about the dynamic of when men and women work together. I think it's a diversity of thought, and that happens to be gender. And when you bring in more experiences of all types of diversity, including deeper technology backgrounds, different generations, then the dynamic is, I believe, that there are more voices, but there's also more listening, more questions, and more ideas. And that diversity is powerful. As Andrew said, it has a tremendous impact, we think, on value, but that's about making an organization successful. So the dynamic, I think, that's different than men and women work together, or when more diverse group overall works together. It may take a little bit more time, but there is more listening, and there's more challenging of thought, and there's more creativity that comes together. And I think it's a very positive dynamic. And that goes, honestly, when I think about the board, with a board that has predominantly women, like the Girls Incorporated women, mostly women board, having more men on that board over the years. Just again, it's diversity. It's not that one is better than the other, but you're different ways of thinking, different perspectives in the room, different questions, different life experiences. That brings tremendous impact and value.
Ivy, there's one interesting example that I can share with you. So I sat in the board council program during the tenure of our first woman chairman, and then I was also exposed to the subsequent two chair, who happened to be men. And there was no question that the woman chair was much more effective and much more frequent in listening and drawing out every and all members of the board to share their perspective. It was very fascinating to notice the difference. And that's a dynamic.
It's fascinating because I'm sitting here listening and taking notes like you can't imagine. But one of the things that really is not surprising, yet it's great that you have brought out, is that the best effectiveness of the board and the board leaders are the raising of questions. And I think it is a little bit perceived that, the board is about decision making, And both of you are talking about the value of being on a board and participating, and the value of raising questions. And as we raise questions, and we have a diverse group that are giving various answers and perspectives, that's where the greatest opportunity for growth, change, and development sit.
Absolutely. If you think about the role of a board and governance, management should be driving strategy, and they should be driving the performance of the organization. But the board is there both to make sure that that's consistent with the values and the mission and the overall longer-term strategy that has been set by the organization, but to raise the questions that management may not think of. And to both on behalf of, yes, the shareholders, but on behalf of really the long-term success of the organization and all of its constituents, the employees, the community, the customers, et cetera. So that, and they bring the perspectives, in the case of an external, independent set of directors, they're bringing perspectives that that management team can't have. So yet at the same time, they're not the experts. They're not the ones running the company. So it really should be questions. Sometimes they're challenging questions. Sometimes they're exploratory. Sometimes they're seeking to understand. Sometimes they're bringing other perspectives. But that's the greatest power and value of a board.
I so appreciate both of your time today. Any tips for young leaders coming up? And I'm putting this as young leaders because we know we have a lot of women listeners, but we also know there are some men out there, and there's, and I look at it as young leadership. Tips, advice for young leaders coming up on the rise.
Well, maybe I can go back to what I said earlier. I do think you got to start young, because I do think the tenure of when we traditionally would have thought we would get on a board is going to shorten. So starting young is very important, and we need young leaders to start the journey a lot sooner and much more aggressively. And I do think globalization is an important part of it. So expanding your global experiences is critical. And if you have an opportunity to participate in mentorship programs, sponsorships programs, or formal programs for board development, absolutely do it, including volunteering on not-for-profit boards.
Yep. And I would just echo that and say that younger, the not-for-profit may be a good first step, while in tandem looking for the sponsorship and the experience about what it would be like to be on a business, a for-profit board as well. And obviously for a not-for-profit, you're bringing time, talent, and sometimes treasure, depending on where you are in that cycle. And for a business board, you're bringing your time, talent, your experiences, very often your network. So to think through what it is that you're bringing to the table, but also how you will grow and build your own capabilities through the experience. And so give thought. Don't overthink it and take too long to get active, but do think through, how do these things tie together? Who you are and what you're doing from a career perspective, and how do you have something that meshes well and reinforces what you're doing?
Well, Ellen and Andrew, I am eternally grateful, and thank you both for taking time out of busy days to join us here on Her Success Story and share a male versus and female's perspective on the impact of more women in the boardroom. Listeners, please feel free to leave a comment below. Let us know what else you want to know, what you enjoyed about this interview. Ellen and Andrew, I believe, are both on LinkedIn. Correct, guys?
Yep.
And leave a comment. Let us know what you enjoyed about this series, about this interview, and what else you want to hear. Hit the subscribe button, and we will be in your inbox every Monday morning. Look forward to you joining us on many more episodes of Her Success Story. Andrew and Ellen, thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.